Hey there, I want to welcome you to today's edition of Journey Through the Gospels. We are now in week 13, and we are going to finish up the Gospel of Luke this week and start into the final Gospel, the Gospel of John. And today we are in Luke chapter 22, and actually it comes to a place where usually we wouldn't be standing in front of a Christmas tree, but it usually happens in the spring in the time of Easter. But that's where we are at today in Luke 22. And it's Jesus is getting ready to go to the cross. He's just had dinner, the Last Supper, with his disciples. And now they're headed to the Mount of Olives to pray. It says, Jesus went out as usual to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples followed him. On reaching the place, he said to them, "Pray that you will not fall into temptation." He withdrew from a stone's throw beyond them, knelt down and prayed, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done." An angel from heaven appeared to him and strengthened him. And being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. When he rose from prayer and went back to the disciples, he found them asleep, exhausted from sorrow. "Why are you sleeping?" he asked them. "Get up and pray, so that you will not fall into temptation." Now, when we think about Jesus, we naturally think of him as he was and is the Son of God. And we think of him in terms of being divine, which he was and is. But when he came to earth, he was also human. And when we think of Jesus going to the cross, many times we think of him going and we think, it was awful and painful, but he was the Son of God. And so, he's going to be able to take that because he's the Son of God. But we also have to remember his humanness. We have to remember that Jesus was human, that he experienced temptation like we experience temptation, and he experienced all other earthly things that we experience. He got hungry. He got thirsty. He got tired and needed to sleep. Some of those natural things that as humans we experience, he experienced those same things. And so when going to the cross, he experienced real pain on the cross. He experienced real mental and emotional stress headed into that cross and the events surrounding the cross. And that's kind of where we find him here as he goes to the garden and he's praying with his disciples, and he goes a little ways away and he begins to pray. And something that you just maybe go right across it and don't even notice it many times. But again it says, "And being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground." And you read that and you think, that must be like a crazy metaphor. Sweating drops of blood. Who ever heard of sweating drops of blood? But it is a real medical condition. And let me read this just real briefly from Lee Strobel's book, The Case for Christ. And in this, he's interviewing a medical doctor, and he asks him about this condition. And he asks him, isn't this just crazy talk, bleeding drops or sweating drops of blood? But the doctor shakes his head and he says, "Not at all. This is a known medical condition called hematidrosis. It's not very common, but it is associated with a high degree of psychological stress. What happens is that severe anxiety causes the release of chemicals that break down the capillaries and the sweat glands. As a result, there's a small amount of bleeding into these glands, and the sweat comes out tinged with blood. We're not talking about a lot of blood, but just a very small amount." So, it is a real thing. And so when you read that, it says Jesus, it says, in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. Imagine, here's Jesus. He is on the night before he's getting ready to go to the cross, knowing what he's getting ready to face. And yet, as a man, thinking about the physical pain and anguish that he's about to face, and now he's praying, and the weight and the pressure and the emotional strain of what he's getting ready to face caused such turmoil internally that it caused that physical reaction of those capillaries opening up and blood entering into the sweat glands and coming out in small drops of blood. I mean, we have to remember, one of the things that we should remember as we enter into the Easter season in the spring, when we think about Jesus going to the cross, we need to remember that he suffered real pain, he suffered real anguish, and he did it for us. I mean, Scripture tells us that for the joy set before him, he endured the cross. I mean, even though it was painful, and beyond what we could even imagine, it says, for the joy set before him, he endured the cross. In other words, he was willing to go through the pain because he knew the joy that was coming by offering forgiveness of everyone's sin who would put their faith and trust in him. So let us never take for granted what Jesus did for us on the cross, and remember the pain and the suffering that he went through, and that he did it all for us. And we should be ever, ever thankful and ever grateful for it. Well, that's going to do it for today. Tomorrow, we're going to be in Luke chapter 23. Hope you have a great day, and I'll see you tomorrow.